It's a system that children's lives depend on, but in the Northern Territory, the child protection system is failing spectacularly. Four Corners has investigated the very painful death of one girl. It found a system taking so many shortcuts that investigations can be nothing more than a single phone call. Katrina Bolton reports.
Deborah Melville has become a symbol of how badly the Northern Territory child protection system is failing.
The Aboriginal children in the Northern Territory are far worse off than any other children, any other population group in Australia, and I'm talking dramatically so.
Four Corners details how the 12-year-old had been placed with a gambling-addicted relative in a house with about 13 others, including a man who'd been charged with sexually abusing a woman. When a family member reported finding Deborah Melville alone with the man in a bedroom, Child Protection authorities didn't step in.
She was crouching down behind the cupboard, hiding, and I asked her what she was doing in there, and she couldn't answer me.
Deborah Melville died in her backyard from a painful, treatable infection that had left her unable to walk or get to the toilet. Child protection workers had seen her on the kitchen floor before she was dragged outside and left with no food or water.
When they visited her the day before she died, they didn't recognise that he was a girl in severe pain with nearly a litre of pus in her leg.
Deborah Melville's death in 2007 sparked investigations, a criminal trial and an inquest. But a major inquiry into Northern Territory child protection last month reported finding the system still routinely breaches even its legal obligations and cuts dangerous corners.
In some cases we found that investigations have been one phone call to a notifier saying, is this kid at immediate risk? And if they're not, that's the end of the matter.
The Northern Territory government has vowed to act. Children's lives depend on how fully that promise is kept. Katrina Bolton, ABC News, Darwin.
And you can see more on that story on Four Corners tonight at 8:30 here on ABC One.
The family of a former social worker says the Ombudsman's Child Protection Report confirms there is still a culture of bullying of staff who raise concerns about the service. The government says the department has been instructed to make sure every child at risk is now investigated and the service is being rebuilt from the ground up. But the Territory opposition says things won't improve until a culture of cover-up is ended.
The husband of former child protection worker Susan Mansfield says the Ombudsman's report proves everything she said.
There's definitely a culture of bullying and harassment that goes on in the departments.
The Ombudsman says as she investigated bullying of staff who complained at-risk children weren't being investigated, it continued.
One of the senior managers at the service, when she was aware that staff were taking time off to come and see the Ombudsman, would insist on driving a staff member to the Ombudsman's office.
When she surveyed child protection staff in April, the Ombudsman found 65% said there was workplace bullying by managers, 63% had no confidence in grievance resolution processes, 24% feared negative consequences if they aired a grievance. In May, staff told the government's own Reform Monitoring Committee there was a lack of communication about reform, many staff vacancies and a lack of systems and processes. Andrew Mansfield says they'd be mad to complain.
If it stays like it is and what they've put my wife through, don't do it.
The government says the service to children is improving.
We've got professionals in the front line, never happened before in the Territory. We've got after-hour notification that was never happening before in the Territory.
The opposition says complaint avenues have closed.
The threat of recrimination is still there. The government's basically eliminated the Ombudsman from the child protection industry.
But the Children's Commissioner, Howard Bath, says anyone with a complaint about services to children can come to him and be completely assured they'll be protected. Jane Barton, ABC News.
The Northern Territory Ombudsman has delivered another damning assessment of the Territory's child protection system. Far from seeing improvements, she says checks and balances have been further reduced. The government says child protection is being reformed, but doctors say there's been little change on the ground.
The stream of children into Royal Darwin Hospital isn't slowing. Many have been neglected or abused.
There are children coming in with serious injuries from non-accidental situations. There are children coming in with sexually transmitted diseases.
The Territory Ombudsman has delivered her report on a catalogue of cases child protection agencies decided didn't need action, including a 2-year-old baby girl reported 6 times before being raped, a 4-year-old boy raped by 3 other boys, and an 8-year-old reported 14 times roaming the streets at night.
If the information keeping was correct and there was a response, then it wouldn't happen. A child like that might be helped after the second notification or the third notification.
The government says the cases the Ombudsman has documented are shocking, but things have improved. It's presented another report it's commissioned, saying the backlog of cases not being investigated has now mostly been cleared, partly using a data cleaning exercise.
The 329 cases that he reports to was cases that actually there were not enough information, sufficient information, but they were evaluated.
The Ombudsman doesn't believe the system has improved, saying checks have been relaxed, not toughened. Many police reports on children aren't being recorded, and the requirement for mandatory investigation of any child reported 3 times has been removed.
So there could be 10 reports about children in the same family within 12 months now, and there's no obligation under their current rules to go and investigate.
The government says 250 cases of children at risk are still on the waiting list for investigation. Jane Barton, ABC News.
A whistleblower who helped expose major failings in Northern Territory child protection says she was intimidated and threatened with disciplinary action. Social worker Susan Mansfield is only now allowing herself to be identified. She says she'd grown frustrated with warnings of children at risk not being followed up, but when a baby was left with permanent brain damage, she couldn't stay silent.
Hospital social worker Susan Mansfield says her warnings about pregnant 12-year-olds, drug-addicted parents and newborns at risk continually went uninvestigated. But when a baby she'd made 4 written notifications about nearly died, it was the last straw.
They weren't responding, and somebody needed to speak out for these children that basically don't have a voice.
She says even before she leaked information to the media, she raised concerns with the Children's Commissioner, and for that she was threatened.
There was a verbal threat of disciplinary action, so you're made to feel like you're doing the wrong thing.
An independent inquiry has confirmed major problems with the way the department deals with notifications of children at risk. The department says even now the intake team that assesses warnings is short a third of its staff, and 800 cases need further investigation.
The intake backlog at the moment is about 124 cases, and the backlog after intake is about 800.
The Ombudsman is also combing through about 50 other cases, some of which she says are breathtaking.
We're comparing the police records, child protection records and the medical records.
Her report is due in March or April, ensuring the whistle keeps on blowing. Katrina Bolton, ABC News.
It's a political bomb dropped on the last parliamentary sitting day of the year. A Healthcare Complaints Commission report into the rape of a baby has found safety recommendations were ignored and lied about. The Commissioner says for the last 2 years, the Royal Darwin Hospital's governance system has been so bad it's probably illegal.
When the 5-month-old baby was raped on the hospital's paediatric ward in early 2006, her medical condition meant she couldn't scream. A hospital investigation recommended security cameras, but the Healthcare Complaints Commission found that 15 months after the attack, cameras hadn't been installed, although they were put in the kitchen to stop pilfering of food.
It is shameful that they have done nothing until August this year.
The Commissioner says when she tried to investigate this year, she had to force information from the hospital, and when she got it, it was inaccurate.
The information we were being given by Health House was wrong.
Under law, the hospital is supposed to be run by a management board, which has to file an annual report every year. But the Commissioner found that since 2006, there's been no report and barely any evidence of anyone on the board either.
The legal implications is that there's a breach of the Act, either by the General Manager, by the CEO of the Department of Health, or possibly by the Minister.
The Health Department says the hospital's board is working and its annual reports have been delayed. The Minister has one word to describe what's happened.
That's unacceptable, Madam Speaker. That's unacceptable.
He couldn't stress it enough.
That's unacceptable, Madam Speaker.
So you would like to...
Chris Burns says he's known about the baby's rape since he became Minister 2 years ago, but only got the report on Monday.
So you knew about it. Order. 2 years, but you got angry on Monday. Not good enough, Minister.
He's promised administrative changes and a $1 million upgrade at the ward so all the Commission's recommendations are implemented.
Anyone who tries to delay or for whatever reason or isn't committed to it, they can be out the door, Madam Speaker.
Late today, the Department CEO, David Ashbridge, issued a statement saying he shares the Commissioner's concerns and is committed to making the changes. The report follows a string of other scandals, a coronial report showing an 18-month-long nursing crisis and a separate investigation into the death of a newborn baby. And there's more to come. There's another Healthcare Complaints Commission report the Health Department went to court to try to stop. It hasn't been made public yet. It could make Chris Burns continuing as Health Minister unacceptable. Katrina Bolton, ABC News. But on the issue of child protection, there was little unity between the Ombudsman and the Children's Minister over government legislation that will mean the Children's Commissioner, not the Ombudsman, investigates future child protection complaints. The Minister says the Ombudsman was briefed and supports the changes.
Madam Speaker, the Ombudsman support the changes.
But the Ombudsman has released a letter she wrote to the Minister this afternoon, saying, "I'm referred to as supporting the arrangements. That is not correct." The government is adamant the changes won't affect any child protection investigations already underway. But in her letter, the Ombudsman says on her reading the changes are retrospective and that for her to continue before the fate of the bill is decided would be a contempt of Parliament.
The Northern Territory Ombudsman has found police acted unreasonably by probing a journalist's phone records to expose his police sources. And the Ombudsman's report has queried whether the officer who authorised the investigation was senior enough to do so. But the Police Commissioner is unrepentant.
When the home of Darwin's Lord Mayor was raided last year, he complained because a police officer tipped the local newspaper off. The journalist who got the tip, Justin O'Brien, complained to the Ombudsman his privacy was breached when police seized his phone records to expose the police leaker, not once but twice. The Ombudsman has told Mr O'Brien after the first search, the second search was an intrusion into your privacy, not reasonable even though it was lawful.
They had this power, they used it, they've abused it. They went on a fishing expedition to see, OK, I think, how many other police officers do I speak to?
The Ombudsman has formed an opinion and, frankly, I don't share that opinion. I'm satisfied that my officers were acting in good faith.
The Police Commissioner has accepted the Ombudsman's recommendation that access to a person's telephone calls must be authorised by a member of the rank of superintendent or above. Interviewed on ABC Radio in November, the Commissioner said the O'Brien phone probe was approved by an officer of a considerably higher rank than superintendent. He's now conceded it was authorised by a senior sergeant.
The senior sergeant, therefore, waits to obtain an approval from a higher rank, and that's in fact what happened.
Law experts say the O'Brien case shows government whistleblowers leaking information are just as vulnerable to exposure as his police source.
Because by leaking they're probably committing a criminal offence, the police can lawfully access their telephone records.
Many may now be worried. The Ombudsman says 800 Territorians had their phone records probed by the police in the 2009 financial year, 900 in the previous year. Jane Barton, ABC News.
The Northern Territory Ombudsman has issued a scathing report about a school chaplaincy program that saw a serial pedophile housed next to a primary school. The investigation found chaplains were trying to rehabilitate the pedophile, despite a judge saying the man couldn't be cured.
The report finds chaplains paid for by the federal government allowed a pedophile to live at this facility in Darwin's rural area. It is next to a primary school and within walking distance of 2 other schools and a shopping centre. When parents found out, they were angry.
One of them said that by placing that man there and trying to rehabilitate him with all of those children's facilities around, including the schools, was like putting Dracula in the blood bank.
The paedophile was eventually moved, but the report also notes that one of the chaplains was called in to help a boy who'd threatened to stab another child.
The chaplains, if they're doing counselling, are breaching the law, and by delivering psychological services for which they're not trained, there is a risk that they can harm a child.
The investigation says that when parents at one school complained, teachers considered boycotting the children's lessons, although the boycott never went ahead. The report also raises fundamental questions about the way the federal government's $160 million chaplain program is funded and whether schools should be required to acquit money they don't have control over. The report was only made public late today. The chaplaincy service and the Territory's Education Department are yet to publicly comment. Lucy McNally, ABC News.
Detain patients or let them die. That's the response of Territory health authorities to the latest Ombudsman's report. The watchdog says Royal Darwin Hospital is detaining patients against their will, calling it a breach of human rights. But the hospital says if it doesn't, patients will die.
In August 2002, the body of Rita Anderson was found just 300 metres from Royal Darwin Hospital. In the days before her death, staff agreed they didn't have the legal powers to stop her leaving the wards, despite her severe brain damage. The Northern Territory Ombudsman says this was the catalyst. To prevent other deaths, the hospital began a period of detaining people against their will.
Which then authorised everyone in the hospital to treat that person as though they had a mental illness.
The report finds this practice contravened the Medical Services Act and the UN Declaration on Human Rights. One man was held against his will for 5 months. Another was chemically restrained when he tried to leave.
On one occasion, there's an entry where he was given an antipsychotic injection and told that it was for his headache.
The hospital's management says to save lives, if patients aren't competent, they'll be detained.
The day in which the lawyers tell senior doctors how to conduct their clinical business is a very sad business.
I know the Ombudsman refers to human rights, but human rights are of little use to somebody who is dead.
The hospital board is so angry, for the first time in its history, it's referred the Ombudsman's report to senior legal counsel for review in the courts.
In these cases, was there one complaint from a patient? No. Was there one complaint from the relatives of the patients about the delivery of clinical care in this hospital? No.
The Ombudsman says though staff may have acted in good faith, it's time for the hospital to investigate how it came to break the law.
The end does not justify the means. That's the road to disaster so far as democracy is concerned.
But she says, given the Territory's high number of at-risk patients, the hospital's policy of detaining people has probably prevented another case like Rita Anderson's. Sarah Dingle, ABC News.
4 independent reports commissioned by the Territory Government highlight there are still major problems with security, staff shortages and governance in hospitals. The government says it's still working on the problems.
It's taken the rape of a baby girl and the death of a grandmother to make the Territory Government take a serious look at its running of its hospitals. The Health Complaints Commissioner found poor security at Royal Darwin Hospital led to the rape in the paediatric unit in 2006. The government says improvements have been made since then, like security cameras.
This report has identified that 70% of the recommendations identified by the Health Complaints Commission have been rectified. The other 30%, we will do it.
But the Health Complaints Commissioner says change is taking too long.
If you read the report and not just look at the executive summary, it's far from 75% has been carried, of the recommendations have been carried out.
The death of 64-year-old Margaret Winter at Royal Darwin in 2006 highlighted a critical nurse shortage. A second report says there are still unsafe staffing levels in some areas of the Darwin, Alice Springs and Tennant Creek hospitals. The minister is out of answers.
The number of nurses we've got in Australia is limited. We can't produce enough nurses quickly enough to fill all the gaps.
The opposition's accusing the government of trying to bury the report findings.
They choose to release them all in one shot, on one day, and provide little opportunity for proper scrutiny.
A third report raises concerns about governance, saying it's not clear who's actually running the territory's hospitals, while a fourth criticises the handling of complaints, saying many still aren't being acted on. The minister admits his department still hasn't apologised to or compensated the raped baby's parents. Jane Barden, ABC News.
Just days out from the election, the Northern Territory Ombudsman has broken with protocol and released a scathing report into a land development bungle in Darwin's rural area. Several blocks in the suburb of Herbert flooded last year, and the Ombudsman says the government knew the risks. The report says the land should never have been sold and the government must compensate residents. Phoebe Stewart reports.
Robin Bott and her partner built their dream home in Herbert last year, but when Cyclone Carlos dumped huge rains on the top end, water from a nearby lagoon flooded their piece of rural paradise.
Gut-wrenching time, it really was. It was very worrying. And then the water just sat there for months.
The Ombudsman investigated subdivisions like Robin Bott's after receiving several complaints of flooding since 2010.
And it came within 30 millimetres of entering the house.
The Ombudsman found the area was never suitable for subdivision, and the Lands and Planning Department knew of the risks and acted contrary to law, adding there is a moral imperative for the government to take urgent action.
The people who bought these blocks were entitled to assume that if the government agencies and processes had approved release of this land as suitable for residential building, then they had done so with appropriate due diligence, and clearly they hadn't.
I'm disappointed in, the people in the government that signed the box, ticked the box, signed off on it. It is disappointing because you do trust them.
The Ombudsman recommended the Territory Government acquire the land, that residents should be exempt from stamp duty on their new property, compensation to cover fees, accommodation and relocation, and the Government investigate legal action against other parties involved in the developments. She says she felt obliged to release the report before it was tabled in Parliament because urgent action was needed before the next wet season.
The government, I think, needs to show some moral leadership here. Forget the legalities. These people lost because their departments didn't do their job. Fix it up and move on.
The government says it will implement all of the recommendations. Robin Bott doesn't want to sell, and she's pleased the government will build a deep drain at the back of her block to protect her home. Phoebe Stewart, ABC News.
Animal cruelty on a grand scale, a university cover-up and bureaucratic bungling. That's what the Northern Territory Ombudsman has uncovered while investigating hundreds of animal deaths on a top-end cattle station. It's possibly one of the worst cases of animal cruelty in Australia's history. And a warning, this story contains images that some people may find disturbing.
In its prime, MATARANKA station, 400 kilometres south of Darwin, was a model of best practice. Owned by Charles Darwin University, it was teaching the next generation of rural workers. But in September last year, images of starving cattle were posted on the internet by angry students. A government investigation found hundreds of starving animals dying on the ground.
Some of them were eaten alive by meat ants, some of them were torn apart by dingoes, and a lot of them just died of dehydration.
The Ombudsman says government confusion about which department should follow up the reports resulted in no action being taken.
When the reports came in, they were simply filed and nothing done with them.
The Ombudsman says the head of the university's Animal Ethics Committee, Professor Bob Wasson, allowed reports about the starving cattle to be doctored before going to senior university staff. The cruelty continued for 6 months and 800 cattle died.
I don't think Bob Wasson intended to cover things up or hide things, but that was the ultimate effect.
We were certainly of the view that the situation had improved towards the end of last year, but it deteriorated again this year.
The Ombudsman says the station's manager, Ian Gray, should have been prosecuted at the time of the cruelty, but now it's legally too late. She says conditions on the station have improved, but it still needs a proper business plan on stocking rates and feed provision to prevent further cruelty. Jane Barden, ABC News, Darwin.
It's been described as a shocking case of animal cruelty. Hundreds of cattle starving to death were left to die. Some were so weak they were eaten alive by ants. All this happened on MATARANKA cattle station, and this week a report by the Northern Territory Ombudsman upheld complaints of animal cruelty at the training facility run by Charles Darwin University. The report found CDU should have done more to stop the animals suffering, and the government failed to take action despite an investigation by its own inspectors. Alison Middleton has the story.
For years, agriculture students have learned the tricks of the trade at MATARANKA station, 400 kilometres southeast of Darwin. In preparation for work in the pastoral industry, students here are taught skills like branding calves and mustering cattle. It was a different scene at the station last year. Complaints began to emerge that livestock were starving and neglected. These photos were taken by the university's staff and students, as well as government inspectors.
This was horrendous. The number of cattle involved, the wholesale emaciation of a huge number of cattle, the deaths of young calves. The pictures speak for themselves.
Well, I've seen cattle starving to death on a daily basis, and they were just very, very thin and lying down dying and couldn't get up. They'd go down, they'd lay down of a day and they just couldn't get up of an afternoon.
Among those who blew the whistle was Toby Gorringe, a lecturer at the station. The university has since moved him 100 kilometres north to its sister operation, the Katherine Rural College. Toby Gorringe says he's still haunted by what he saw.
Well, they're locked in small paddocks for long periods of time with the lack of food and supplement lick. I've seen cattle dying in the droughts down home where I come from, which is the Birdsville-Windora area, but no one could do anything about that. But this was avoidable. They shouldn't have done this.
Mr Gorringe says he complained to his superiors for 6 months to no avail.
Things just didn't get any better. They got worse, if anything. The cattle were still dying on a daily basis.
In January this year, he went to the Ombudsman.
Well, we had no other choice. All we wanted to do was save these cows' lives and calves and weaners, and we just had nowhere else to go. That was our last straw.
Students complained, staff complained, there were complaints to the Minister. There were investigations by the Livestock Inspectors and Department of Resources, and it was happening. But nobody's ever found out why it was allowed to happen.
These black marks around its neck are actually flies.
Oh. The Northern Territory Ombudsman, Carolyn carried out her own investigation. Her report was released in Parliament yesterday. She found that 800 of the estimated 4,500 cattle at MATARANKA station died last year from starvation and dehydration.
There were a number of them who died in awful circumstances, that they've been allowed to fall to the ground, and instead of being destroyed immediately or fed or looked after, some of them were eaten alive by meat ants, some of them were torn apart by dingoes, and a lot of them just died of dehydration.
When the cows come up, we'll get the number of each cow.
The Ombudsman said she would have recommended that the then station manager, Ian Gray, be prosecuted, but the 12-month limit for such action had expired. She's urged the government to step up enforcement of the Animal Welfare Act after finding that reports on MATARANKA station by government inspectors had been merely filed instead of acted on.
The inspectors that we spoke to gave us very graphic details of how horrible the treatment of these animals was. They were, to some extent, demoralised that there was no prosecution. And I think the report just highlights that there's no point in having a law if you don't enforce it.
The Ombudsman also found the university's response once it became aware of the neglect was inadequate.
I think they were defensive. I think they didn't move quickly. I don't think they actually understood the severity of the situation and the suffering of the animals.
We gave instructions immediately that the difficulties began last September that supplementary feed and additional resources should be provided. Clearly at the station itself, there was a slow response.
The university's Vice-Chancellor, Professor Barney Glover, questions whether the stock losses were as high as 800. But he says regardless of the exact number, the university recognises too many stock died from neglect.
On behalf of the university, we're very deeply concerned and we regret the difficulties that arose at Mataranka Station during the period you've identified. The Ombudsman's report has indicated that the primary reason was the actions of the station manager at the time, compounded by, within the university, poor communication.
The university says the public can be reassured that the operation of Mataranka Station has dramatically improved.
We're certainly satisfied with the progress our current station manager has made in lifting the condition of the cattle and the infrastructure at the station to what we believe is now an appropriate level.
I was asked to come and take the station forward, and that's what I've come and done.
Gary Riggs, the owner of nearby Lakefield Station, has been appointed as the interim manager. He's sold off 2,000 cattle and is putting in infrastructure like more watering points for stock.
The infrastructure that was here could not support the number of cattle, and we just lightened them off a little bit, and we've gone and put new waters in and fences, paddocks, fixed everything up, and now those cattle could be well and truly supported here now.
The university has set up an independent advisory committee to oversee operations at Mataranka. It's also working on a business plan for the station's future in line with the Ombudsman's recommendations. One option the university is considering is ending its lease at Mataranka Station and shifting most of its operations to the Katherine Rural College.
I think what this unfortunate set of circumstances demonstrates is that a university involved in a working cattle station, particularly in the Northern Territory, particularly with the relative isolation of Mataranka from other parts of the university, does provide a risk environment that is difficult for us to manage.
They must change it. It's no good the way it is. How you going, old girl? It's followed up properly, not ignored and told that you don't know what you're talking about, when you clearly you do. That's why I was employed in this job, because that's what I do for a living. And they didn't want to take any notice of me. And it's proven that I was right. And it's up to them to change it, I think.
Alison Middleton with that report. Further to that story, Mataranka Station's former manager Ian Gray says he strongly rejects the Ombudsman's findings. Mr Gray disputes that 800 cattle died. He says the mortality rate was far less than that and below what might be expected on any Territory cattle station.
A string of disturbing cases involving police and prisoners have been highlighted in the annual Ombudsman's report. The force was also criticised for being too young and inexperienced, and the Ombudsman says there's deep-seated cultural problems within police ranks. Iskander Razak reports.
The recent recruiting drive means there are plenty of young police on the beat in the Territory, but the Ombudsman says that's a problem and the cause of many shocking incidents.
So what? I'm the law.
And they overreact. And they've been taught to drop people to the ground rather than back off and try and cool things down.
In one case, a teenage prisoner was put in a cell with an Aboriginal man that wanted to fight him. It says he was then punched up to 5 times with both fists and later told, "You got bashed by a black." In another incident, an officer ate a prisoner's food. He then went to a box sitting on the bin containing breakfast rubbish and took out toast and a carton of milk for the prisoner to eat. But those in charge aren't concerned about the report or the perceived generational divide.
That's why the police, as well as general recruiting, are also recruiting experienced officers from interstate.
I don't believe that there is a deep or systemic problem.
The Acting Police Commissioner Bruce Wernham says all new recruits are given extensive training and are supervised by senior staff. He says the incidents in the Ombudsman's report have been investigated and all the recommendations in it have been acted on. The police force wasn't alone in receiving criticism from the Ombudsman. She says the Corrections Department has also treated prisoners and their families cruelly. In one case, a Tiwi Islands woman hitchhiked to Alice Springs prison to see her son, who was serving an 8-year sentence. But she was denied access because she didn't have photo ID.
She had pension cards, she had other things, but they would not let her in. I think that was inhumane.
But the Ombudsman says changes have been made to fix the problem and now only short-term prisoners from the top end are sent to Alice Springs. Iskandar Razak, ABC News.
Watching ABC News, I'm James Glenday. A prisoner has taken court action against Northern Territory Police. The man sued them for using excessive force, assault, wrongful arrest and false imprisonment. And the Supreme Court agreed, awarding him more than $100,000 in damages.
Marcellus Majindi can be seen here in April 2010 being brought into the police watch house. Prior to his arrival, he'd been hit in the face with a baton while being unlawfully apprehended. He was angry and spat at police. Senior Constable Wayne Miller then punched him. In the Supreme Court, Marcellus Majindi sought damages from Northern Territory Police. The judge rejected Constable Miller's evidence he'd missed Majindi. I'm satisfied that Miller deliberately punched the plaintiff to the side of the head quite forcibly. The victim's lawyers say police originally disclosed only some of the footage of the incident.
We realised we only got part of it when we reviewed it and we counted the cameras, and it turned out that significant CCTV camera vision wasn't provided.
The judge said police later removed Majindi's belt and frog-marched him to a cell with his buttocks exposed, which was humiliating. The judge ordered the Northern Territory government pay Majindi $90,000. The officers involved were also told to pay. Constable Adam Fitzel, who hit Majindi with the baton, $10,000, and Senior Constable Wayne Miller, who threw the punch, $5,000. Justice Dean Mildren found Majindi to be an honest witness, but he repeatedly rejected the evidence of the two police officers, finding it to be changing, inconsistent, or just impossible to be right. Miller's evidence in particular, he says, was unconvincing. I formed a very poor impression of him as a witness of truth and reliability. It's too late for the officers to face disciplinary action.
Time has expired because there is a 6-month time limit to take disciplinary action against the officers concerned.
Police are yet to comment on the judgment, saying they'll need time to fully consider the decision and whether they'll appeal. Katrina Bolton, ABC News, Darwin.
Millions of dollars and nearly